government. The good news is that now that you've learned a whole lot about the federal government, you know probably about 80 or so percent of what you need to know about state government, because the federal government was patterned after the original 13 states, and all the remaining 37 states are patterned after, well, the federal government. So they all have something in common. They look kind of alike, they act kind of alike, and there's a reason that we take state governors to become president, because they've kind of already done the job. Every state is required to have a state constitution. Every state is required to have a republican form of government. One of the differences between the national government and state governments is that there can be some direct democracy at the state level. They're supposed to be mostly republics where voters elect officials to govern the state, but there can be sometimes where the entire voting public of a state actually gets together on a referendum or an initiative or some kind of state ballot measure, and they all vote on it collectively. That does not happen at all at the national level, but it does happen at the state and local levels. So there can be some direct democracy involved. That's why it says republican form of government, not republics. If it was just a pure republic like the U.S. federal government, then states would be required to be republics. But instead, it says they are required to be republican form of government. So they can have some direct democracy. Like the national government, states have all three branches of government. They have a judiciary, a legislature, and an executive. So let's take a look at the executive branch of government. We'll start at the top with the office of governor. The governor is the head of the executive branch that acts very similarly to the president, has a lot of the same kind of powers as the president. The governor signs bills into law, has the power to veto bills, is the head of all the various different agencies for the state, and so on. Governors may issue pardons, amnesty, and reprieve inside their state in the same way that the president can pardon people for federal offenses. State governors can pardon people for state offenses. In 43 states, there is a position very similar to the vice president called lieutenant governor. And in all of those states, the lieutenant governor presides over the state senate in the same way that the vice president presides over the U.S. Senate. Most states have a 4-year term for their governor, including Oklahoma. And in Oklahoma, the gubernatorial election, and yes, that is the correct adjective for that, gubernatorial, I like saying that word just because it's funny sounding. The gubernatorial election is held on even years between presidential elections. So we had one in 2002, 2006, 2010. When will the next one be? Yes, 2014, next year, coming up. All governors have veto power. Most governors, unlike the president, though, also have the line item veto. Yes, the governor of the state of Oklahoma, Mary Fallin, can actually line item veto. She does not have to veto an entire bill. She can veto just certain line items from a bill. The line item veto, as we discussed in the previous unit, is designed to try to control wasteful spending because, unlike the national government, states cannot go into debt. They're not allowed to. State and local governments are not allowed to take on debt. So the federal government can do that because they can print money and they can just make up money, and they can borrow money. But the state and local governments are not allowed to. So they've got to keep their spending under control. And one of the useful ways of doing that is through the line item veto. Why is it that the U.S. president was not allowed to have the line item veto? Well, as you may remember, in Clinton versus the city of New York, the Supreme Court decided that the president's line item veto was unconstitutional. That it says in the United States Constitution that the president can either have veto a bill or not veto a bill. It doesn't say they can veto part of a bill. And the thing is, remember, every state has a state constitution that is different than the United States Constitution. They're similar in some ways, but different in others. Well, if it says in a state constitution that the governor can line item veto, then they can line item veto. State governors, like the president, can call the legislature back into special session after they've quit for the year, or if they're on holiday or something in the event that some emergency comes up. State governors, like the president, have the ability to declare martial law. Martial law, by the way, is oftentimes called a state of emergency. Put in your notes that martial law is where the military is temporarily in charge. That's where they will have soldiers on street corners and so on, maintaining order. Now, generally speaking, this only happens in the event of some kind of huge, wide area natural disaster, like, for example, Superstorm Sandy, Hurricane Katrina, those kind of things. In which case, they will call out the military to assist in maintaining order and also rescuing people and providing emergency services like water and electricity temporarily, shelters, for example. When a state does that, when the governor calls up the state's army, remember the state's army is the National Guard, so they will call up the National Guard, and the governor is commander-in-chief of both the state police and the National Guard. The state legislature works the same way as the United States legislature does. They are Congress for the state. And in 49 states, they have a bicameral legislature. Nebraska has to be different. They have a one-house Congress. But in every case where there are two houses, it's always called the state Senate. The upper house is always called the state Senate. The lower house is usually called the State House of Representatives, like here in Oklahoma. That's what we call it. But in some states, they can be called different titles, different terms: the General Assembly, the Legislative Assembly, General Court, whatever they're called, they have the same function. They're essentially the State House of Representatives. And the state Congress does pretty much what the U.S. Congress does. They control money, they pass laws, they spend money, they have impeachment power to remove people from office and so on. And yes, the state Congress has used that on state officials here in Oklahoma. We actually had two state governors that were impeached and removed from office. You'll learn about that more in your Oklahoma history class. Both houses are required to be drawn on a one-man, one-vote basis. And what does that mean? That means that each House and Senate district, state House and state Senate district, have to have the same number of voters in them. And the reason that was because Oklahoma drew up these House and Senate districts when we became a state in 1907, and then never changed them at all, ever, until 1964. Well, what happened between 1907 and 1964? A whole lot of history, for one thing. And people moved into the cities. There weren't big cities in Oklahoma. There were no big cities in Oklahoma in 1907. But by 1964, people lived instead of living out on the farm, they lived in Tulsa and Oklahoma City, and still do to this day. So, what effect does that have? That meant that Tulsa and Oklahoma City had like one representative each. And farm districts with 50 people, and where there's more cows than people living in them, had like 3 or 4 representatives. Well, that doesn't make a lot of sense, where you have a few 100,000 people represented by one person and like 50 people represented by 2 or 3. So the thing is that Oklahoma refused to change. And the Supreme Court said, no, 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 you will change. You must change. And the state of Oklahoma said, make me. So they did. The federal courts actually redrew all of our congressional districts and did our gerrymandering for us. And we hated it. And ever since 1964, we have done our own gerrymandering every time the U.S. Census comes out. So, but that's required. Uh, you will want to write these two numbers down. The Oklahoma State House of Representatives has 101 districts. The Oklahoma State Senate has 48 districts. Those could appear on a quiz. In fact, they actually are on a quiz. The state court system is patterned after the national court system, and it's really very, very similar. One of the great examples of federalism is looking at states, how they're structured, but especially at state court systems, because the state courts and the federal courts look and act a whole lot alike. They kind of do similar functions. They operate in a lot of the same ways. Same rules of evidence are used in both state and federal courts, and so with a couple of exceptions. Louisiana is a whole different matter because their legal system has elements of the Napoleonic Code blended in with it. So they have this like French structure, legal structure, kind of hybridized into their state law. But everywhere else, it pretty much operates about the same as the federal bench. There is a big difference, though, where state judgeships come in, because what happens is that there's really two ways you get to be a judge in the state of Oklahoma. One is that the governor appoints you, just like the president appoints most federal judges. So does the Oklahoma governor gets to appoint state judges. And if they're not appointed, then they have to run for office. Like my good friend Judge Cantrell, he has to run for office every so often, and get elected. And the thing is, it's kind of awkward because they're not supposed to campaign, and they're not supposed to be political, and they're not supposed to put a Republican or Democrat initial next to their name when they run for judges. But then again, how do you get elected if you don't campaign? So it's kind of an awkward position there. So here's the thing with the state judges that are appointed. And those are the top ones. Those would be like on the state Supreme Court, state courts of appeal, and things like that. We, the voting public, get to decide whether we keep those judges. Every so often, there will be a state ballot that comes up that says, shall we retain Judge so-and-so in office, yes or no? So the voting public actually gets to decide whether we keep those judges or not. It's called the Missouri Plan. They don't have that at the federal level. Once a judge is on the bench, man, they have their judge for life, or their job for life. As long as they want to have that job and they're not taking bribes or something, they have that job forever. In Oklahoma, the voting public can actually kick off a judge. Now, having said that, guess how many times that the voters in the state of Oklahoma have ever gotten rid of a judge? If you guessed 0 times, you are the lucky winner. Bing, bing, bing. Because we have never actually removed a single judge that way. But we have it. And every so often an election will come up where we have that as a possibility. Shall we retain Judge so-and-so in office, yes or no? States fundraise by a variety of different methods. States tax on energy. They tax income. In fact, I think about 8 states have income taxes, state income taxes. Oklahoma does. States can charge sales taxes, but they don't want to try to do that too much. And of course, states, I think every single state now has a state lottery where they sell lottery tickets. And as previously mentioned, states have their own armies called the National Guard.